Oxfordshire's Phil Mercer.
More questions than answers.
BBC Oxford.
With Phil Mercer. Phil Mercer.
95.2 FM.
On the Weekend Breakfast Show.
And the more I find out, the less I know.
Do you know, this book, which I've started to read, unfortunately I haven't got all the way through, is one of the most terrifying I've read in a long time. Marc Gerstein's Flirting With Disaster is a subject for more questions than answers. How many times have we heard it was an accident waiting to happen? Sadly, accidents and disasters do happen, but could we do more to stop them? Well, Marc Gerstein has just published this book called Flirting with Disaster, which looks at some of the fascinating psychological and social reasons why the alarm bells don't sound sooner, or the disaster isn't prevented completely. It looks at the space shuttle crashes, Arthur Andersen at Enron, and the subprime financial crisis in the States, amongst many other things. And Marc is on the line now. Very good morning to you, Marc.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm very well, although nervous, having read your, certainly the start of the book. Unfortunately, I was only handed it yesterday, so I was making a good trawl through it last night. It concerns me that a book like this is necessary, and I know this is what you try to sum up, but why are we so bad at learning from mistakes?
Well, I think that's probably the central question that the book raises. My simple answer is that we're sort of not designed to learn from mistakes very well, either psychologically or socially. I think people would much rather go into denial in a way about horrible things that might happen to them to minimize the damage and to go about their business. And I think that organizations are not built to learn, they're built to carry on. And so I think we have to do more than we've been doing.
And this is something that you experienced firsthand. I mean, what is your background? It feels to me like you're sort of a disaster predictor in a lot of ways.
Well, I didn't start off doing that. I started off as an engineer, then became fascinated by organizations and the fact that my engineering colleagues found it easier in many cases to design things than to get them implemented. So I studied organizations for a long time. I sort of backed into the disaster field because I had what you might call a Cassandra experience of predicting something that was going wrong with one of the organizations that I was working with, and not that many people would listen to me. And so I sort of went on a quest to discover whether or not such things were common or not. And to my surprise, I found that they happened all the time. And the more I learned, the more I felt that it was a story that needed to be told.
You term this thing called bystander behavior, where people tend to stand and watch when something is going wrong, rather than actually take any action about it.
Well, I think in most organizations, it's a tiny bit more complicated than that. I think that people do usually make an effort to tell their bosses or their colleagues that something that they see that might go horribly wrong, but then they give up somewhere along the line. In the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, which I talk about at some length, there was an engineer whose job it was to exactly analyze those kinds of things, and he tried in a variety of ways to bring them to other people's attention. And his boss, in a note to him, said that he didn't want to be Chicken Little and raise this to senior management. So there wasn't very much support for it, and at a very important meeting, this particular engineer gave up and didn't make a fuss when other people didn't want to go further.
There are plenty of parables around, aren't there, along those? Chicken Little, the Cry Wolf, and things like that. And, you know, if you're there trying to be a bit of a scaremongerer, you can get a reputation for that kind of behaviour sometimes.
Well, I think that's exactly what happens, and people make choices about whether or not they would like to sort of get a reputation as a troublemaker, or whether they basically want to get along with their sort of bosses and colleagues by not drawing too much attention to it, and basically they give up. And when they do so, the risk persists even though their efforts may not. And then when the horrible things happen, we sort of look at each other and say, well, if they knew, how come they didn't do anything about it? And that's the central question in the book. Why didn't they do something about it?
I suppose part of the problem is that if they had done something about it, the disaster wouldn't have happened, and nobody would be discussing it now, if you see what I mean.
I think that's absolutely right, and I mean, I think that there is always a certain criticism that you can bring to any effort of this kind that says, well, of course, these are the things that go wrong. Think of all the positive things that nobody ever hears about. And I suppose, while that's a completely accurate statement, it doesn't take too many floods like the one that England suffered last summer for people to say as well, maybe if it's true anyway, we should do a little bit more than we have done.
Yeah, and actually that's quite interesting, because I was going to bring that up as a subject, because I think a lot of people, especially after the floods, which really badly affected Oxfordshire last year, were, well, you know, if the following things were done, we wouldn't be badly affected by the floods. I mean, something like flooding is a natural disaster, really, isn't it? Because, you know, we can't control when it's going to rain and by how much it's going to rain. Are you kind of suggesting that there are things that man can do that will make it easier when things like that do happen?
Well, I'm explicitly saying that that's the case, and I think the Pitt report makes that point, I think, very pointedly. I was reading through the beginning of it when it came out, and it's very clear that there are many, many things that could be done, should be done, must be done to make sure that that people are better protected than they were. I mean, simple things like understanding the location of likely floods and organizations that are charged with that responsibility working better together. I mean, it's pretty hard to make cases that you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. One interesting point that you bring up, the fact that, you know, if we did listen to the advice, it would probably end up costing us considerably less than it does to stand back and let nothing happen and then deal with the disaster when it occurs, like Hurricane Katrina, for example.
Well, in all of these cases, there are, you know, it's a question not only of how much, but also who pays. In the case of Katrina, the burden falls on the citizenry, whereas the precautions would have fallen on various levels of government. And in many cases, the issue for government is that they would have to raise taxes in order to deal with the issues, or they'd have to not spend on something else, and they may not want to do that. So it creates a great dilemma, and they sometimes roll the dice, and many times they win, which is why they're encouraged to do so, but when they lose, they often lose in a big-time way.
What needs to happen to make people start to pay attention to this advice? I mean, do we need to hand your book direct to Gordon Brown and to Bush and or whoever's going to be the next president of the United States and say, look, learn the lesson?
Well, I'd be very happy for them to read the book, but whether or not it would actually make a difference, I think, is a very big and open question. One of the points raised by Daniel Ellsberg's afterward, Daniel being the man who brought the Pentagon Papers to the world, is that in many cases leaders are in fact the problem, and that they make these decisions consciously, though not necessarily publicly. So I think we need to, as a citizenry, put more pressure on our public leaders to make sure that they have our best interests in mind and not just their own political interests.
Marc Gerstein, you're a fascinating chap. The book is stunning, and I'm looking forward to finishing it off now. But thank you very much. It's Flirting with Disaster. It's out now on Union Square Press, and we'll put the ISBN number and details like that on our website as well. But thank you very much for joining us this morning.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Marc Gerstein, then. It's 95.2 FM. We'll catch up with the guys doing the Relay for Life in a moment.